Well, good morning. We're going to wait another minute or two and allow others to join us. We'll get started in just a minute. Hope everyone's looking forward to discussing resiliency in today's world. I'll just take a minute to introduce myself. Well, good morning and thank you all for having me here today. My name is Michelle Gasper and I work with Debbie Martis at Rebirth Homes. I'm a licensed therapist here in California and I oversee the counseling program and the training for Rebirth Homes. I also have a private practice where I counsel people from all walks of life and with varying degrees of problems. Having a heart of compassion is a beautiful thing and can also be a problem if we don't keep ourselves balanced. So this presentation is really based on some it's based on experience and research. So with that, let's get started. So in 2 Corinthians, Paul tells us, he comes alongside us when we go through hard times, and before you know it, he brings us alongside someone else who is going through hard times so that we can be there for that person, just as God was there for us. And most people who enter helping professions usually do so based on a passion or compassion for that population that they're working with. We experience satisfaction when we see others blessed. And Proverbs 11:25 tells us that the one who blesses others is abundantly blessed. Those who help others are helped. So sometimes we can have difficulty, though, balancing that out. So let's explore compassion satisfaction, compassion fatigue. We're going to talk about burnout and how to live that out in balance. So what we're really talking about is our professional quality of life. And included in that is compassion satisfaction and compassion fatigue. And we want to keep that somewhat balanced. Of course, we'd like to have more satisfaction than we have fatigue. Compassion satisfaction is known as the positive aspects of helping, and fatigue is known as the negative aspects of helping. With satisfaction, we get pleasure and satisfaction from working in these helping caregiving systems. On the compassion fatigue side, it includes the difficult aspects of working in caregiving systems, which can include burnout and what we call work-related trauma. So Christ said, "Are you tired, worn out, burned out on religion? Come to me. Get away with me and you'll recover your life. I'll show you how to take a real rest. Walk with me and work with me. Watch how I do it. Learn the unforced rhythms of grace. I won't lay anything heavy or ill-fitting on you. Keep company with me and you'll learn to live freely and lightly." And that's in the Message version of Matthew. And my thought on that is, if it's in scripture, it was obviously common enough for Christ to address his people, back then, and it's still relevant today. So the definition of compassion fatigue is the physical and mental exhaustion and the emotional withdrawal experienced by those who care for sick or traumatized people over an extended period of time. It includes the apathy or indifference toward the suffering of others as a result of overexposure. And that's the definition from the Webster's Dictionary. So it includes, like, the compassion fatigue is kind of like an umbrella, and included in that can be burnout and secondary traumatic stress. And those are two different things. So burnout is really work-related hopelessness and feelings of inefficacy, where secondary traumatic stress is, it's work-related secondary exposure to extremely or traumatically stressful events. Now, both of them can share a negative affect. Burnout is more about being worn out, where the secondary traumatic stress can induce fear, or it's about being afraid. Some of the signs and symptoms that you can experience in either burnout or secondary traumatic stress are feeling burdened by the suffering of others, impaired ability to make proper work-related decisions, isolating yourself, feeling a loss of pleasure in life, difficulty concentrating, maybe insomnia, physical and mental fatigue, bottling up your emotions, increased nightmares, reduced ability to feel sympathy and empathy, feelings of hopelessness or powerlessness, frequent complaining about your work or your life, the impact on identity, worldview, and spirituality, excessive use of drugs or alcohol, maybe we call that self-medicating, poor self-care, diminished sense of work environment or enjoyment, and denial. And the reason denial is highlighted is it's one of the most common and detrimental symptoms because it prevents those who are experiencing compassion fatigue from accurately assessing how fatigued and stressed they actually are. And unfortunately, that keeps them from seeking help or having the ability to fix it. Okay, activity time. So that brings us to the professional quality of life scale, which hopefully you all received in advance and were instructed to at least complete the first page. So if you have that with you, we're going to start reviewing that now. You can go ahead and pull that out. And this was created by Beth Hednaw, and it measures compassion satisfaction, burnout, and compassion fatigue. I think we're going to open it up so that if you have any questions as we do the scoring, you'll be able to either raise your hand or Kevin can open you up to ask your question. Okay, so the first one we're going to talk about is the compassion satisfaction category. So on that scale, I believe if you have, sorry, your page looks something like this, where you've got all three of them on the same page. I broke it down so that we can talk about each one. So first we're going to do the compassion satisfaction scale. And as you can see on your questionnaire, if you could take the coordinating numbers and just enter your total on each line that coordinates with that question. And as you're doing that, I'm going to talk about the compassion satisfaction and what that means. So it's really about the pleasure you derive from being able to do your work well. For example, if you may feel like it's a pleasure to help others through your work, you might feel positively about your colleagues or your ability to contribute to the work setting or the greater good of society. So higher scores on this scale represent greater satisfaction related to your ability to be an effective caregiver in your job. And this is only related to your job, and it's not you as a whole. You might feel a great deal of satisfaction related to other areas of your life than your job. And I want you, we're going to use my scores as an example. So in this category, I scored a 45. So if we look at the way it's scored, you'll see on that scoring sheet that, okay, here we go. So you'll see on the scoring sheet, if they're in that table, it's basically saying the sum of your compassion satisfaction question, and it breaks it down if it's 22 or less, between 23 and 41, or 42 or more, and that's considered low, average, or high. The second column there says, so my score equals, and that can be a little confusing. Basically what she was saying is that these are averages. So most people scored around 50, or like if you, 57 or more indicated high levels. So in related to this measure though, you can basically kind of ignore that center column and just know that 20 on your score, 22 or less is low, between 23 and 41 is average, and 42 or more is high. So we're gonna go ahead and go through each of the three, and then we can take questions on that. Okay, so now we're going to do the secondary traumatic stress, which is the last scale. The reason why I lined it up this way is the middle one, the burnout one, is a little tricky, so we'll do that one last. So just like you did on the compassion satisfaction, go ahead and copy your rating on each of the questions onto that table and then add them up. And then once they're added up, you can find your score on the table to the right. Same idea You can kind of ignore that center column. And again, I'm just going to talk a little bit about the secondary traumatic stress. So the difference between secondary and primary is primary, you're actually experiencing the traumatic event yourself. Secondary, or what we call vicarious traumatic stress, can be when we experience stress as a result of hearing somebody's account of their traumatic experience. You're watching their expressions, you're you know, having empathy for their feelings as they're expressing it. And sometimes when that happens over and over, we can experience what's called secondary traumatic stress. So if you're out, the average is around 50. So again, if your score was over that 42, yeah, 42 or more, it I just there's something about your work that could be frightening or threatening to you, or maybe you're experiencing a lot of that secondary traumatic stress and you're not having outlets to really process it. So a higher score doesn't mean you have trauma. It just might be an indication that it could be helpful to you to examine how you perceive your work environment. Maybe talking to a colleague, supervisor, or even a therapist can help. We use the term, it's interesting because in the field of therapy, you know, we deal with a lot of PTSD, and in that we can experience a secondary traumatic stress. So we have a term that we call consult, and we have, if, you know, if you're working with the same counseling center, then you're covered under that entity and you're allowed to discuss certain cases or specifics, not specifics, themes in your cases, and it allows an environment for consulting where we are able to kind of roll through our experience at dealing with that, and it just makes us better therapists overall. We also have this funny saying where every good therapist has a good therapist. Okay, so let's go forward to the burnout scale. So this one's a little bit tricky, and it's in science, it's called a reverse score. And the reason that we do this reverse score is because scientifically, the measure just works better when the questions are asked in a positive way. And anyway, so if you see numbers, the numbers with the asterisks, numbers 1, 4, 15, 17, and 29, those are the ones that are going to be reversed. So first, I'd like you to go ahead and enter exactly what you answered on your scale in that first column there with the coordinating questions. I'm just going to pause for a minute so we can get that done. As we're doing that, I'm just going to talk a little bit about the burnout scale. So most people have that intuitive idea about what burnout is from research perspective. Burnout is one of the elements of compassion fatigue, and it's associated with the feelings of hopelessness and difficulties in dealing with your work or doing your job effectively. Usually the negative feelings have a gradual onset. You may not even realize you're there. They can reflect the feeling that your efforts make no difference, or they can be associated with a very high workload maybe, or a non-supportive work environment. So a higher number on the scale just means that you're at a higher risk for burnout. So I'm going to go back to that scale again real quick. Okay, so now that you've got all your numbers in that column, the ones with the asterisks, if you see the little table on the bottom left corner where it says you wrote, then change it to, I don't know why the number 1 is missing in that first box, but if you wrote number 1, you should change it to number 5. So where you see that under your score area, where you see, let me see if I can show you, where you see the second column, I want you to write the reverse score right in there, according to that table on the bottom left. So again, if you wrote a 1, you would change it to 5. If you wrote a 2, you would change it to 4. If it's a 3, it stays a 3. If you wrote a 4, you change it to 2. And if you wrote a 5, you change it to 1. And I'm going to pause there because I'd really like to know if anybody's got questions or if that's confusing at all. Maybe we can clear that up before we move on. Is that okay, Kevin?
Yeah, absolutely. I don't see anything in chat or any hands raised. In case you can't see those options, it should be in the center of your screen of the Zoom window, that is. You should see a little icon to click to raise your hand, or a chat bubble in order to open up the chat window. But right now I don't see anything coming in.
Okay, perfect. So, okay, we'll go ahead and move on then. So now that we have our scales, we're going to talk a little bit um, about this, and especially with the burnout scale. If you scored high in that range, it's really time to implement some good self-care. So we're going to explore self-care and what that looks like. Okay. Um, so I have this analogy that we are like teapots. We have all these little teacups around us that we're constantly pouring into. It could be work, family, children, homework, meals, bill, whatever it is. We've got all these little teapots that require of us that we pour into. So the idea is we can't pour from an empty teapot. So what fills our teapot? Well, let's talk about self-care. So self-care is learning to maintain resiliency so you can continue doing your work well with energy, care, and compassion. So what kinds of things, there's probably things that you can already identify that are good self-care that fill your teapot. So I'm going to talk a little bit about teapot tips. Um, these first few seem so basic, but they really have such a huge impact on us. Evaluating your sleep hygiene, so getting enough good quality sleep. Um, Eating good quality and nutritional meals throughout the day to maintain your energy. Exercise and water. Um, again, these seem so basic, but according to the Australian Institute of Family Counseling, drinking enough water keeps our brain from having to struggle against the effects of dehydration, allowing us to think more clearly than if we let ourselves get dehydrated. Staying hydrated is one aspect of good physical, emotional, and mental health. And did you know that just 1% below optimum levels can cause brain fog, headaches, and slowed blood flow, which inhibits the function of our prefrontal cortex. So our prefrontal cortex is the area responsible for reasoning. So if it's almost like this chain reaction, if we have slowed blood flow, by the way, which also happens when we have a heightened state of perceived threat, which is associated with trauma. Both of those categories can slow our blood flow, which cause the prefrontal cortex to slow down. And it does inhibit our reasoning. So even just drinking enough water in the day can allow you to think more clearly. Finding a little bit of pleasure each day goes a long way. Walking, reading, going shopping when we can again, um, enjoying a long bath. All of those things are really beneficial to our overall self-care and mental health. Highlighting the good. While there can be many difficult moments, days, or weeks in our work, and especially lately in the light of COVID, balancing that with those little mission moments where we see positives happening as a result of the work that we do can help make it worth it when we're stuck in the trenches. Um, Schedule time in your day to pray, meditate, journal, or simply relax. One of the great techniques that is so simple but very beneficial is doing a mindful moment. For example, I like to take what I call a mindful walk. My backyard's not huge, but it's big enough for me to go in the backyard, just walk around. I've got some flowers back there. We pay attention to like we utilize all of our senses to pay attention to what's going on in the moment right around us. Maybe I'm feeling a cool breeze. I'm hearing little birds that just hatched in their nest. I'm smelling some flowers. So I'm using my sense of smell, my ears, my eyes, even the feeling of the breeze on my skin. All of those are what we call mindful moments, and they can just help bring us back to a sense of balance and peace. Though that can also be really helpful. And taking a self-care day, maybe you're at the point, or we get to a point where we realize, you know what, I think I just need a day off where we can focus completely on self-care. Some other ones are focusing your empathy. So your empathy for others helps you to do your job. So it's important to take good care of your feelings and thoughts by monitoring how you use them. The most resilient workers are those that know how to turn their feelings to work mode when they go on duty and off work mode when they go off duty. It's not denial, it's a coping strategy. It's a way to get maximum protection while working and the maximum support while resting. And you know, I've got two examples of this. One, when I was a brand new therapist, hearing a lot of people's hurts was really difficult to hold all that. And I realized that as I was going to the counseling center, there was this huge church that had like this dome on it, and it stands out. And so I used that as my focal point, where when I left work, it was on the way to the freeway. I left work, and when I got to that place, I took all of those burdens and I just left it there. And I took off that work hat, and then I continued home, so that when I got home, I had already processed that and was able to be present, and not carry those burdens with me. And then as I would return to work, I would do the same, where once I passed that spot, I would start thinking about my clients again, how I could best be of service to them, you know, for the rest of the drive to work. And so with that, though, that brings up an interesting issue with COVID. We don't have commute time anymore because everybody's working from home. So maybe it's worth scheduling that time in your day where you are able to, at the end of the day, you schedule 30 minutes to just go do a mindful walk and use that time as your commute time or your processing time to kind of resolve whatever it is that was going on throughout the day. And to be, you know, to be able to take off that hat and to switch those, to switch that. Okay. So one of the other things that I wanted to talk about was building a support system. Having people, either colleagues or maybe people who really understand what your work is like or what it entails. Maybe you can do like weekly meetings where sometimes you just check in with each other as part of the meeting to be able to make sure everybody's doing okay mentally, and in that idea of burnout or compassion fatigue, just kind of checking in, being a support system to somebody else and enlisting their support too. Practicing deep breathing. Again, another one that we say, okay, I breathe all the time, but really this is quite effective because like I said, when we are in a state of perceiving a threat, our heart rate goes a little bit faster. Maybe we notice our palms are sweaty. And what happens again is the blood flow slows and our prefrontal cortex shuts down. So it really does directly affect our ability to reason. So I have what I call this 5-5-5 rule, or guideline. So what that is basically you're just counting to 5 as you breathe in through your nose, and then you hold it for 5 seconds, and then you blow it out through your mouth for 5 seconds, and you do that 5 times. And amazingly enough, simply breathing actually makes you feel more relaxed, and it enables you to think more clearly. Taking time to self-reflect. Allowing time for self-reflection helps us be in tune with our physical, our mental, and emotional state. So getting to know your own thresholds allows you to recognize and intervene on your own behalf when you're able to notice those levels rising. And then allowing space for grief. So grieving losses is really important because it allows us to free up energy that's bound to either the experience, maybe the loss of an object, the loss of an idea, or even a loss of a person. And we do that so that we can reinvest that energy elsewhere. And healthy grieving results in the ability to remember the importance of our loss, but with a newfound sense of peace and not pain. Let's talk a little bit about grief. So grieving is not a problem, it's a process. And healthy grieving allows us to work through that. And I want to think of grief as a spectrum. For example, I might be really looking forward to chocolate ice cream and I go up to the counter and they're all out. And I think, man, I really wanted chocolate ice cream. That's on the far end of the grief process over here. Then we're going to progress, and there might be, I got in a car accident and now I'm grieving the loss of my car and dealing with that. Maybe there's something deeper. I just lost my job and now I'm dealing with the grief over that. And then there's, COVID happening and we are redefining how we do most things. So there's a grief process that goes along with that. And it can extend to the deep grief of losing somebody that you love. So if we picture grief as this spectrum, there are different elements and levels of grief. However, the phases that we deal with are pretty consistent. Dealing with ice cream, I can go real quick, easy through that. Dealing with the loss of a job or somebody that I love is a little more intense and takes more time. So with that, I want to talk about the phases of grief. They're titled phases because they're not necessarily consecutive stages. So the 5 phases of grief, or sorry, the 6. There's 6. The 6th one was introduced recently. So they're denial, anger, bargaining, depression, acceptance, and finding meaning. And these are all a part of the framework that make up our learning to live without the expectations or the ideals that we thought we have. They're responses to loss that many people have, although they are very different from person to person. So everybody can experience these a little bit differently. And these are just words that we're kind of using to help us frame and identify what we might be feeling. And like I said, they're not stops on this linear process of grief or a timeline. Not everyone goes through all of them or in a specific order. And it's grief is just as unique as each individual is. So I'm going to talk a little bit about denial and what that looks like. Denial helps us to survive the loss. In this stage, maybe the world, and again, I'm talking, as I describe these, I'm going to give you what it looks like on that far end of the spectrum, and know that you can experience these at any degree, depending on what your loss is. So denial helps us survive the loss, and the world becomes meaningless, overwhelming. Maybe life isn't making sense. Maybe we're in a state of shock and denial, maybe feeling numbness or feeling numb inside, wondering how to go on, maybe even why we should, trying to find a way just to get through each day. Denial and shock help us cope and make survival possible. Denial helps us to pace our feelings of grief. There is grace in denial. It's nature's way of letting in only as much as we can handle. As you accept the reality of the loss and start to ask yourself questions, you are unknowingly beginning this healing process. So anger. Anger is a tough one because we tend to condemn ourselves when we feel certain feelings. And anger tends to be one of those that we get upset at ourselves for feeling. But be willing to feel the anger, even though it might seem endless or it might seem senseless to experience, but it really does have its purpose. Sometimes out of anger, as we continue to process, it generates that passion or compassion. So being willing to feel your anger is really important in there. Bargaining. So after a loss, bargaining might take the form of like a temporary truce. What if I devote the rest of my life to helping others? Then I can wake up and realize this has all been a bad dream. Sometimes we can get lost in a maze of if only or what if type statements. And that's under the heading of bargaining. Really, like I said, we don't enter and leave each individual stage in this linear fashion, but through bargaining, we can really recognize when we have those if only or what if questions. And then acceptance. Acceptance is really, sometimes it's confused with the notion that it's okay or it's all right. And that is not what this means. Acceptance is really the stage about just kind of wrapping your head around the idea of this new reality. So instead of denying your feelings, you're listening to your needs, and we move, we change, we grow, and we evolve out of that. So finding meaning, approaching it as an experience instead of judgment, like I said, it just allows that time and space needed to find meaning. And when we get to that place where we're finding meaning in our grief, amazingly, we find hope. So I want to share a picture of what grief looks like to me when I experience it. And maybe some of you can relate to this. Really, it seems like when we're grieving something, like I said, you might find yourself going in and out of all those different phases, and then back to another, and then in and out of another one. And it's okay, you get through it the easiest when you just allow space for it to happen, and you continue to wrestle through it as you go. So remember earlier when I said finding meaning leads to finding hope. So I want to talk a little bit about hope. Hope is an optimistic state of mind that's based on an expectation of positive outcomes with respect to events and circumstances in one's life or the world at large. So as a verb, its definitions include expect with confidence and to cherish a desire with anticipation. So in Romans, Paul says, don't burn out. Keep yourselves fueled and aflame. Be alert servants of God, cheerfully expectant. So that kind of, I mean, if you listen to that, that kind of indicates that we must have some control over that or some choice in the matter. If we can be, if we're instructed to keep ourselves, then that means we should be provided that ability to keep ourselves. And fueled in a flame aligns with the teapot analogy. And here's another good one. Think of a car. If you start driving it and you drive and you drive and you drive and you drive, what's going to happen? You're either going to run out of gas, you're going to burn out the engine, it's going to stop eventually, right? So in order to keep that car going, what do we need to do? Shut it off once in a while, fill it with gas, check the oil, check all the fluids. Um, so, so when we're talking about being fueled in a flame, that's kind of in alignment with that too, right? And if we picture ourselves as that car, then we need to pause and fill it up with gas. And so that's where that self-care comes in. Or think about this: when you've been on an airplane, what do they say all the time about if the oxygen masks fall down? What are you supposed to do? You put it on yourself first so that you can breathe in order to put it on maybe a child or somebody who's unable to put it on themselves. So again, those are all concepts of self-care and how self-care can really stimulate hope in us. So let's clear the clouds and talk about redefining our vision. So somewhere along the line, what got us started in this? We were passionate about something, right? We came up with a vision, then we created a plan that led us to reach this goal. So if the passion and the goal are the same, then really all we need to do is readjust that roadmap. And how do we do that? Well, we want to reignite our passion. Remember why we started this to begin with. That can help you reignite that. We want to refocus, where we refocus our attention and paying attention to that vision that got us to the plan. So when we go to the plan, we just need to readjust it. Maybe the end goal is the same. Maybe we need to readjust the goal or realign the goal a little bit. But how do we readjust that plan to continue to reach our goal? We got to get more creative in today's world, and dealing with the grief and allowing that anger to reignite that passion so that we can refocus our vision, readjust our plan, and realign our goal. And that is living out hope. So I came across this a long time ago and it really impacted me. So I thought I'd share it with you. How do we make our dreams come true? Well, a dream written down with a date becomes a goal. A goal broken down into steps becomes a plan. And a plan backed by action makes your dreams come true. So let's talk about some of the reminders that we can use as buffers against compassion fatigue and burnout and just dealing with redirecting our vision. So a mindset to buffer against compassion fatigue will include things like seeing the good while accepting the bad. Knowing that self-care is essential to our mental and physical health, and that it's okay to set compassionate boundaries. I'm big on analogies, so I'm going to use another analogy when it comes to boundaries. So if you picture yourself as a house, let's say, you've got your house, you have your yard, you have your white picket fence at the end of your yard, and then there's a sidewalk in the street. And if you allow people in your house all the time, it's an open door policy, people can come and go whenever they want. Eventually, you're going to run out of food in the fridge, their house is going to be dirty, but there's constantly people there, so you don't have time to clean it up. If people are camping out in your yard, then you can't care for the yard. So it makes sense that we have this picket fence at the end of our yard so that we can we can close the fence when we need to care for the yard. We can close the front door of the house when we need to care for the house. So think of you as your house and employing compassionate and healthy boundaries. They're necessary. I mean, even Christ said, you know, we need to retreat for a while. He went up to the mountains to pray and to rest. And, you know, it's it's okay to give ourselves permission to have healthy boundaries. I think sometimes people with extra measures of compassion tend to struggle with that too, feeling like guilty or something for having an end time or setting a boundary. But at any rate, just picture yourself as that house, and that it is okay and necessary even to have an end time. Okay, 10 p.m., lights out, everybody can leave and go home. And now I'm going to clean up my house. I'm going to cook new food. I'm going to restock the fridge. I'm going to take care of my yard. And you have the authority and the power to designate when that door's open, when your fence is open. Maybe the house just needs a day with the door being completely shut all day, and you guys hang out in the yard and barbecue or something, and then you can, again, say goodbye and close your fence. So at any rate, it is okay and completely healthy to set compassionate boundaries. And here's a quote from Brene Brown that I really like. Compassionate people ask for what they need. They say no when they need to. And when they say yes, they mean it. They're compassionate because their boundaries keep them out of resentment. So think about that. Again, with burnout, you might even experience some of that resentment where it brings you into this place where you're resenting either the job or maybe the people you're caring for. And so healthy boundaries keep us out of resentment. So one of the things that I found too is called the Caregiver's Bill of Rights, and it's put out by the Compassion Fatigue Awareness Project. You can find it online. So it says, as a caregiver, I have the right to be respected for the work I choose to do, to take pride in my work and know that I'm making a difference, to garner appreciation and validation for the care I give others, to receive adequate pay for my job as a professional caregiver, to discern my personal boundaries and have others respect my choices, to seek assistance from others if and when necessary, to take time off to re-energize myself, to socialize, maintain my interests, and sustain a balanced lifestyle, to my own feelings, including negative emotions like anger, sadness, and frustration, to express my thoughts and feelings to appropriate people at appropriate times, to convey hope to those in my care, to believe those in my care will prosper in mind, body, and spirit as a result of my caregiving. So with that, I want to thank you for listening and open it up in case we have any questions. I'd like to be available for you if you have any questions or thoughts about or comments about what we discussed today.